Sophie Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 17. It's a Go. Seconds felt like hours to the girls as they sat during maths waiting for Kingsley to walk in the door. They had children arriving late at school quite a lot, but never had the world potentially depended on a child turning up to school on time. Sophie sat uneasily in her seat. She chewed her pencil and leant back on her chair. Before she knew it, she was rocking backwards to get a better view of the classroom door to see if she could see Kingsley. "Sophie, don't rock, please," Mrs. Phoenix requested politely. Without realising what she was doing, Sophie was so far away in her world that she didn't hear the demand and, as a result, didn't acknowledge Mrs. Phoenix or stop rocking on her chair. "Sophie, I've asked you once," Mrs. Phoenix asked again. Fortunately, Yasmin heard her and pushed Sophie's chair back on the ground, catching Sophie off guard. "What are you doing?" she chunted as quietly as she could at Yasmin. "She's stopping you from getting into trouble again, young lady," Mrs. Phoenix interrupted. Sophie stared at her, completely oblivious to the two requests Mrs. Phoenix had made of her. "Why?" Sophie asked. "I beg your pardon. I have asked you twice to stop rocking on your chair, and you've ignored me both times," Mrs. Phoenix retorted, understandably put out by Sophie's ignorance. "Sorry," Sophie said half-heartedly. Before Mrs. Phoenix could launch into any more of a telling off, the classroom door opened and Kingsley walked in. Plan B was a go. Putting it into motion, Sophie asked a still put-out Mrs. Phoenix, "Can I go to the toilet?" Mrs. Phoenix looked completely bewildered at this girl who had ignored her request twice and was now asking a question that she full well knew the answer to. "No," came the response. "Can I?" Yasmin asked, seeing an opportunity to step in. "No," replied Mrs. Phoenix, getting even more worked up. "Can I go then?" Clara asked. The lesson was fast descending into a farce. "Look, no one is going to the toilet. You should have gone before school started. Those are the rules. You know that," Mrs. Phoenix said in an aggressive tone that the children had now gotten used to, so it had lost all effect. Sophie was infuriated by the ridiculousness of the situation. The world, or the very existence of millions of children on it, could be at stake, and she wasn't going to be stopped by some trumped-up coward of a teacher who had no idea what was going on. As a result, Sophie stood up from her seat and started to make her way towards the door into the corridor that led to the toilet in Mrs. Phoenix's eyes, but the reception area to Sophie, where she knew she would find Esmeralda. She confidently strode through the room, and the chairs of her classmates parted for her as she began what the children saw as a mini revolt against the supply teacher. "Where are you going?" Mrs. Phoenix demanded to know. "I am going to the toilet," Sophie replied, without breaking stride or making eye contact with her teacher. "You are not, young lady. You walk out that door, and it won't matter what's going on at home. You will be in huge trouble," Mrs. Phoenix shouted. Sophie ignored her, walked straight past Kingsley, who was baffled as it was normally him getting told off by a teacher, and opened the classroom door. Without a second thought, Sophie walked straight through it and down the corridor. Mrs. Phoenix and the rest of the class, including Clara and Yasmin, sat there in complete disbelief. As she turned the corner, which would put her on a straight path to the reception area, she noticed from the 15 metres or so she was away from it that there was only Mrs. Tabard there, and she wasn't talking to anyone. Esmeralda must have left already. Sophie had to think on her feet, and so hid in one of the other toilets she was supposedly going to, out of sight. Almost straight away, she realised she would have to zone into the school car park to catch her as she walked down the drive. There was no time to lose, and she zoned out again and found herself surrounded by the teachers' cars. She quickly scanned everywhere around her. There was no sign of the changeling. Sophie then zoned onto the pavement at the bottom of the school driveway to see if she was walking down the road. Again, there was no sign. A message flashed up in front of her eyes. It was from Clara. "Kingsley says his mum left pretty quickly. He doesn't know his new address, but knows he always turns right out of school and walks for about 5 minutes. You don't want to come back here. Mrs. Phoenix is calling in Mrs. Jones about you walking out of class. They're searching the school for you." Sophie knew she would have to deal with that later, and so went to zone to the bottom of the road. Before she did, a group of 4 women, with what appeared to be their small pets, hurried past her down the road as well. Sophie didn't have time to study them carefully, but assumed the smaller animals were dogs, although they could have passed for imps. The changelings could sense that Desmeralda was close, and so Sophie had to move fast to get her to Miss Sisson's. Zoning to the bottom of the road, Sophie spun a full 360 to see if there was any sign of her. Finally, seeing Desmeralda coming towards her, Sophie zoned so that she was right in front of her. Shocked at having a 10-year-old girl appear out of nowhere immediately in her path, Desmeralda took a step back. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "That doesn't matter. Take this," Sophie replied, giving Desmeralda the modified implant that she had kept in her pocket. Still confused, Desmeralda took it, but then asked, "What is it? What do I want this for?" Sophie knew exactly what she had to say to cut the conversation short. "Run home, put it on, and it will take you to Jane." The look of confusion on Desmeralda's face changed to one of realisation. "So you do know her, and you know where she is?" Sophie cut her off. "There's no time for that. Get home." Desmeralda realised straight away that Sophie was serious and hugged her before saying a very heartfelt and forgiving thank you. Sophie watched her run down the road and turn the corner. There were no changelings in sight, and Sophie breathed a huge sigh of relief, although it wasn't actually breathing, as Sophie was still in her avatar. Now, though, she was going to have to face the music at school. Walking out of class was a serious thing, and not the sort of behaviour that people had come to expect of children at Pinkleton Primary, never mind one of the school's best role models and most recognised pupils. Before Sophie did zone back into school, she took a deep breath, which again meant nothing with her being in her avatar, and looked up at the sky. Flying very high overhead were three of the largest, weirdest-shaped birds she had ever seen. Activating the zoom function on her avatar, she identified them straight away. They weren't birds at all. They were Pegasuses, horses with wings. She had read about them with her dad when she was younger, but had obviously never seen one in the wild before. But here they were, three of them flying in constellation. Sophie remembered what Miss Sissons had said. The mythical creatures were very gradually growing in number, and so were logically becoming more common, and they seemingly weren't shying away anymore. Sophie was experiencing this firsthand now, and it was a glorious sight. Their smooth white fur was only beaten in beauty by their glorious manes, which swished down their backs like lightning stroking a cloud. At that moment, Sophie wasn't watching them fly overhead. She pictured herself sitting upon one with the wind racing through her hair, and no cares in the world bothered her. Having taken their beauty and majesty in, as well as the fact that they were there in the first place, Sophie was quickly brought back to reality by realising she was going to have to go back to school. Worried, she zoned off the street. She couldn't face going back to school just yet, so she zoned back into her body in Yasmin's bedroom first, but knew that there would be some sort of deadline. It wouldn't be that long until the teachers checked the toilet she was in. She was sweating and felt sick to her stomach, even though she hadn't moved. Having never done anything naughty in her whole life, up until the start of this week anyway, she really had overstepped the mark today, and there would surely be no lying her way out of this one. Punching Kingsley had helped her get away with it. Lying about Ryan getting her into trouble, she had been saved by the dragon on the field. Lying to her mum about homework was something that every child had done at some point in their lives. This time, looking at it from Mrs. Phoenix's point of view and the point of view of the rest of the class, she was guilty as charged. She had just vehemently disregarded the teacher's request and left the room without permission. As she staggered to her feet, still in a state of shock at what she had done, Sophie tried to think of her options and the consequences. Mum and Dad would surely be called in again, and with whatever it was that was going on at home, it would upset them both even more than it would have done. Continuing to hobble around Yasmin's room, walking over Clara's zoned-out body, Sophie started to feel even worse. The idea of disappointing her mum and dad, even Lizzie, was the worst feeling she had ever felt. It was all for a good reason, Sophie thought to herself. Nobody will ever believe me, though, was instantaneously her next thought. Can Clara and Yasmin help me out? Sophie had no idea how they could. They would be defending the indefensible and would surely go down with Sophie. Eventually, Sophie sat herself down at the desk in Yasmin's bedroom and, having calmed herself down as much as she could and done some soul-searching, came to the only conclusion that she could. She was simply going to have to face whatever punishment was thrown at her. As she had done previously, she would have to hope her reputation as a good girl would help her out, although Mrs. Phoenix had very little experience of that, so Sophie would be banking on Mrs. Jones, who knew Sophie and saw her as the good girl she needed to be right now. Also, Hopefully, as it was the final day before half-term, most of it would be forgotten about by the time they all came back. This was the only silver lining Sophie could think of. After a few more seconds to compose herself, Sophie lay back down in Yasmin's bedroom and zoned back into school. The only thought that relaxed Sophie even slightly was that the mission she had been given had now been completed, and that, by now, Desmeralda would be face to face with Miss Sissons. The Sophie Hardy Saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.